name is Jill Feldman, and I was diagnosed with lung cancer in 2009 at 39 years old. I am married. I have 4 kids and a dog. I live in the Chicago area. I love to spend time with family and friends. I am an active person, outdoors, especially when it's not winter. And I love to travel. So, but really, I love to volunteer. I love to give back. Yeah, so my story is really different than most people because it started long before I was diagnosed with the disease. When I was 13, I lost 2 grandparents to the disease within weeks of each other. And then my dad was diagnosed 6 months later with lung cancer. And he died 3 months after that at the age of 41. And then when I was in my 20s, both my mom and my aunt died of lung cancer. And again, my mom, was diagnosed and she died 6 months later at the age of 54. And then 2.5 years later, my aunt, her sister died. And my aunt was like my second mom. We were raised that way. We were very close family. And so I was devastated. I was a hot mess, to be honest. And this was back in 2000. And so I desperately tried to find something to get involved in. I needed to find a way to confront this disease that devastated my family. And there was nothing, 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 nothing for the first year that I looked. And then I always say coincidence or fate. The first organization in the country dedicated exclusively to lung cancer research was founded in my community in the north side of Chicago, North Shore of Chicago. And a friend introduced me and took me to my first meeting. And so this was in 2001, and I did what I could to advocate and to educate myself. And while doing so, I was diagnosed with lung cancer in 2009 at 39 years old. My kids were 6, 8, 10, and 12, and their only association with the disease was death. They were scared, and my biggest fear became reality. I was following in my family's footsteps. And really, at the time, there wasn't any promising research that convinced me that my path would be different. Research was moving in the right direction, thankfully, at the time, not fast enough. But I think what really I've seen over the past 15 years, really the past 5 to 7 years, though, is this revolution of advancements in research and treatment for people diagnosed with lung cancer. And so I have had a front row seat to this rapidly growing field. As a patient, I have benefited from many of those treatments. And, when I was first diagnosed in 2009, I was originally stage 1. But then when my dad was diagnosed with lung cancer, I was in 8th grade, and I couldn't believe it. I really couldn't believe it. Now, at the time, and there still is a stigma associated with lung cancer, and there was a stigma. Now, I didn't know many people who had lost a parent to cancer, but I did have one other friend whose dad died probably 6 months before my dad. And I just remember thinking, how come no one is asking Shelley if her dad did something to deserve or die from colon cancer? So, yet people, well, your dad smoked, didn't he? Your dad has a smoking history, didn't he? And so immediately the compassion and the empathy given to other people was not given to me. And so I struggled with that for a very long time. My dad was also a contractor. He worked with asbestos. I mean, he was 41 years old. Like, we do not know what was the carcinogen that caused the lung cancer. Number one. And number two, does it matter? Does that mean he deserved to die? Did it mean, that the family deserved less empathy and support? No, it doesn't matter, right? Like, what matters are the people. Nobody deserves this awful disease. Certainly nobody deserves to die from it. So I really struggled. I really struggled with that for a long time. My mom was diagnosed with small cell, and so it can be more aggressive. And I was 27 years old when she was diagnosed. I did not believe that she was going to die. Like, I couldn't even fathom it. So, she had a wonderful response to treatment, but the cancer came back shortly after. And she ended up dying 6 months after she was diagnosed. I was 28. I had a 15-month-old. I was 9 weeks pregnant with my daughter, and it was gut wrenching. Like, I really, really could not believe that I was orphaned by this insidious disease. And I remember thinking, thankfully, I have Dee Dee, who's my aunt. And she was a second mom to me. I mean, I talked to her every single day, and it was, and my mom was her big sister. So she was devastated. And, my mom, we all called her Mother Earth. She took care of everybody. And my aunt really struggled with it. But I was grateful to have her, except less than a year after my mom died, my aunt developed a third cancer. And at the time, she had already had two lung surgeries. She had an upper right and upper lobectomy. Well, lung is finite, right? So, I mean, basically, I always say, like, she ran out of real estate. She could not have any more lung removed. You cannot live without your lungs. And so she went through the traditional therapy, which back in 2000, your options were chemotherapy, radiation, or surgery. There were no targeted therapies, there was nothing else. So she started with chemotherapy, and unfortunately, the cancer spread, and she died about a year and a half later. And so that was when I really spiraled downward. I couldn't even believe it. And again, nobody would nobody would acknowledge, nobody would entertain the idea that this disease could have a hereditary component. It was so easy to say, well, they had a smoking history. Well, my mom had been quit for 15 years. I mean, I don't even know if she would have been eligible for screening at this point, because if you quit more than 15 years, then you're not eligible. My aunt too. So and I just remember, you know, really trying to understand how this happened, that it could not be a coincidence. And so that's really, I think, when I started advocating without even knowing it, by pushing doctors and asking, and finally getting my own doctor to say, you know what? I don't think it's a coincidence. And I think, you should get a scan for a baseline and we'll go from there. So I got a baseline scan, and the scan was clear. And I'm glad I got the baseline scan. And then, through my mom and my aunt, the work that I did in advocacy, there was a pulmonologist I knew well, and he recommended I go 3 years later. And I did. I was 30, everything looked good. And then I had 4 kids. And so I skipped, and kind of waited 5 years. And I got a scan at, that point, and they found a nodule. Now, at that time, I had been really involved in advocacy. I think I was vice president of longevity because by the time I was diagnosed, I was president. But for some reason, I wasn't scared. And back then too, we were, 2006, we were just learning about ground glass nodules more. And so we watched it. So I got another scan 6 months later, 6 months later, then a year later. And at that point, they said, oh, there's been no significant change, no further follow up necessary. And my doctor and the pulmonologist said, yeah, I think you probably should have a follow up. And we all deferred to the pulmonologist as to when I should follow up. And he said, just do it yearly, Jill, because then you're not going to forget. And they're low dose. And sure enough, a year later, that ground glass nodule took a nasty turn, and there was a little brother there as well. And that's, when I was diagnosed. So I was very thankful that I didn't listen to the radiology report, that I discussed it and talked about my personal risks versus radiologic risks in general when they're looking at scans. I was shocked. And then I was shocked that I was shocked because I advocated that anybody could get lung cancer. But it was one of those moments where I just couldn't wrap my brain around it. And so I wasn't formally diagnosed till I had surgery. I mean, there was no question, after asking many, many people, no question it needed to come out, and they were almost certain it was cancer. But I just thought to myself, how many times does one family have to hear it's cancer, it's lung cancer? And that consumed me. How was I going to tell my kids? Are my kids going to go through what I went through? And, are they going to lose a parent at a young age? And I was 13 when my dad died. My oldest was 12. So, I could totally identify with him. It was definitely one of those surreal experiences that, I'll never forget, a time in my life I'll never forget. All I could think about was I literally was diagnosed with the same disease that I watched kill my mom and my dad. Like, I still get emotional when I think about it, because it, those were the two most difficult, worst times of my life, right? And so the two most important pillars of my life, and here I am, 39 years old. My kids are 6, 8, 10, and 12. And I was just consumed with, are they going to go through what I went through? And it was so, the only thing worse than, I think, for a lot of people being diagnosed with cancer and the fear that you live with is watching the people you love suffer, and the fear in their eyes because of your diagnosis. And That's was what and I could almost feel it because I could totally identify with it. So that was it. That really paralyzed me for a little bit. But then I thought, okay, I'm going to be the story of hope. I'm going to be the poster child for early detection, because I was originally diagnosed with stage 1. And so it took a lot of work, anytime anyone's diagnosed, none of us are exempt from going, whether we're cured or not, we all have to go through that deep, dark tunnel because it is a life changing experience. And, it's traumatizing in many ways. And so, I think people, I didn't get to where I am in a day or overnight. It was definitely a process. Truly, when you're first diagnosed, you are just trying to survive. It is like being drop kicked in a foreign country. You don't know where you are. You don't speak the language. You don't know the culture. The terrain is unfamiliar. You don't have a map, yet you have to figure out how to survive with a mountain lion chasing you, as you also are navigating this fragmented healthcare system and simultaneously confronted with making difficult treatment decisions, knowing there's no room for error, but struggling with whether the benefits are going to outweigh the risks. And this is all happening at a time when anxiety and distress cloud your ability to think clearly. That sounds overwhelming. And I say that a lot to researchers and to oncologists because that is exactly how people feel. So we need to know when to have the conversations, how to have the conversations, and think about the way we're talking to people. Think about the context of their life, their family. And so I'm really hoping we move more towards that empathic communication and really, it's not something that oncologists learn in school. Their degree doesn't depend on it, but it is at the heart of the patient experience. And so I feel like those conversations should be guided by the care team. And I don't think there's one perfect time for them to happen. I think it depends on, what, patients and families could really absorb. But I do think, that conversation about biomarker testing and lung cancer should happen right away, right? So it's almost like they test right away to see whether you have small cell or non small cell, and they test right away to see whether the non small cell is adenocarcinoma, squamous cell, or large cell. So I'm hoping we're moving towards now testing even further, because whether you have a biomarker or not, your treatment depends on that answer, and the right treatment depends on that answer. When I was first diagnosed, they just started testing for EGFR and KRAS. And I had known about EGFR just because of, like I said, when I was diagnosed, I was president of longevity, and we had funded some research in that area. And so I got the testing done, and I was EGFR positive. Now, it actually guided my treatment from there because adjuvant therapy for lung cancer at the time had very minimal benefit, right? But I needed to be able to look my kids in the eyes and know I did everything in my power. So I had already planned that I would have, I look at adjuvant therapy or therapy after surgery as almost like insurance, right? And so I needed to do it. And so in I thought I would probably have chemotherapy because that's what, the adjuvant therapy. But because I was EGFR positive and because I knew what was going on in the field at the time, I had a discussion with my doctor and I ended up going on a targeted therapy that there was a clinical trial in Boston, but I had four kids. I couldn't travel. I couldn't afford it, and I didn't have the time. And so I took the drug off label for, which means I took it off the trial for about 16 months. It is the only time in the past 15 years that there hasn't been any visible cancer. So it worked while I was on it. And that I look back and I think about it and I think, well, was it worth going on the treatment? The side effects were not great. In fact, they were horrible. I won't lie. Was it worth it since the cancer came back? And for a while, I thought, no, I would never do that again. But, I really reflecting back on it now, I think about it. Well, what if it did prevent the cancer from spreading elsewhere? What if it did slow it down? I don't know. I don't know any of it, but I know for me, it was the right decision at the time. And my oncologist said, went to me when he said your emotional well-being is just as important to me as your physical well-being. I knew it was the right decision. So the way usually you would hope that your doctor would discuss with you that, okay, we're going to take a biopsy of the tumor so we can understand this cancer better. And hopefully they'll mention biomarker testing, part of that process. Now, the one thing about biomarker testing is that it is done after they already look at what type of lung cancer it is. So they have to get that information first. And then either some places have in house testing, most places still send a piece of the tumor to a company that will do the biomarker testing. And the process takes a couple weeks, which is very anxiety provoking. I just had a biopsy in the spring and I'm a veteran patient, right? And the anxiety is consuming. You want to know, and you don't even know what you want to know necessarily, but you just want to know because one of the worst parts of all of it is waiting, right? It's like hurry up and wait. And then you're waiting and once you get a plan in place, does the anxiety doesn't necessarily go away, but you're less anxious about not having a plan because now you have a plan. Well, for me, the greatest impact is, my dad died 3 months after he was diagnosed, just a few weeks before I graduated eighth grade. My mom died 6 months after she was diagnosed, and just, 6 months before the birth of my daughter. But because of advancements in research and treatments, I have lived 15 years. I've celebrated moments and milestones with my family. I saw all four of my kids not only graduate eighth grade, but graduate high school. And those are the treasured milestones that were stolen from my parents and me because they didn't have the treatment options that are out there now. And everybody, the true value of all this research for patients and families is hope. Hope represents a chance and every patient deserves a chance. I never used to use the word hope in the same sentence as lung cancer because in my experience there wasn't any, but there is now, and it's a few things, and it's you know, hope and reality are not mutually exclusive. They both can live in the same space. And I've learned that. And I've learned that, hope is more than a cure, right? So hope represents whatever a patient is hoping for at that time. I hope the treatment works. I hope I can, live to see my child graduate or get married, or my son get married, whatever it is. Hope, there is always hope. But there is real palpable hope in lung cancer now, and I think my family history illustrates that hope. I got a tattoo as a permanent reminder. I swore I would never get inked. I thought, oh, I'll get sick of it, but I needed that permanent reminder that there is hope. And again, I think my family history and my story illustrate hope and progress in lung cancer. And it's a vital emotion, and it's something, I always say to oncologists, you aren't going to save every life. As much as you think you could, you won't. But if you help patients and families find their hope, you will make a difference in every single life. And that matters also.